at the bottom, workflow rules do support some of the same actions. So they can both create a task, they can both update, they can both send an email alert. Workflow rule can send an outbound message without code. With Process Builder, you need call Apex to get to that same functionality. Here's a bit of a comparison, and then I'll share some reasons you might choose Process Builder over workflow rules. So workflow rules, if I want to update something, it does do a field update. It can update the record that kicked it off, so itself, and up. Remember, it can do one, like my example, change on the opportunity causes an update on the account. It can create a task record. It can send an email alert, or it can kick off an outbound message. But we have a longer list on the right-hand side. For updates, the record that kicked it off can do upward, can do down, any related record. Can create many types of records, not specific just to tasks. For notifications, you can do an email alert as well as a chatter or custom notifications. And it can kick off these other automation options. Apex, another process, an auto launch process, a flow with Flow Builder, and an approval process, and then can also work with Quip. So why might I choose Process Builder over workflow rules? Well, first, just for the sheer number of options, sheer number of actions that it can automate, flexibility in how I set it up, the ability to have multiple if-then statements in my process, and the ability to control the order of those, and the ability to version my process. So again, 50 versions total, only one active at a time. Let's talk about an approval process, and then we will take our last break. So I think that this is not far off from our pacing of where we landed when I taught this one on Monday. So I think we'll probably get about a 10 to 15 minute break still, and then should still have time to wrap up on time today. An approval process. This is the only side we'll see on approval process. Again, you want to know the basics of it. You don't need to know quite as much information as you do about workflow rules and Process Builder, which is why we had a few slides on each of those, just the one slide on our approval process. You have this submit for approval here, because unless an approval process is kicked off by some other automation, a user actually has to manually click submit for approval for a record to enter this process. So what might I use to automate kicking it off? I've done it with a Process Builder. I've done it with a flow. Developers can write an Apex trigger. So process, flow, Apex trigger can automate submission into an approval process. You as an admin would define entry criteria. So what entry criteria must be met for a record to enter this process? We probably don't want all records entering this process. Then we have our initial submission actions. So when a record enters an approval process, it is always locked. That is not something I can control. The record is always locked. But you can also automate some additional actions. And as I'm writing these, I hope you're thinking that those look familiar to you. In addition to locking the record, you can automate additional actions, and they are the same actions that workflow rules automate. FTEO, field update, task, email alert, outbound message can also be automated by an approval process. Then you need at least one approval step, but maybe you have multiple. And you'll define what happens if a record is approved, if it's rejected, or if you choose to allow recall. Now, whether or not you use this for an expense report in your own org, my favorite example of an approval process is comparing it to submitting an expense report. When I have an expense report, I submit it for approval. And when it gets submitted, it's locked. I'm not able to make changes to it. It's sent off to my manager. Now, in my current job, if I realize I forgot to make a change or I forgot to add a receipt, I have the ability to recall it myself, which is kind of nice that I can pull it back if I need to. In my old job, if I realized I forgot something, I didn't have the ability to recall it myself. I had to call my manager and say, hey, I'm so sorry. I missed something. Can you send it back to me? In my expense report, it always goes to my manager. So he always has to say yes or no, I approve or I don't. But sometimes it goes through an extra step. Sometimes I notice I get an email alert. There's our E action, an email alert that audit has it. And maybe it depends on the amount of my opportunity or the amount of my expense report, whether or not audit has to look at it. So there could be multiple steps and there can be different criteria for each of those steps. Now, if it's approved, payment is sent off to my credit card and I get an email. If it's rejected, I get another email and it's sent back to me so I can make those changes. Again, you might have different examples of an approval process, but that's kind of a helpful one to keep in mind. My simple takeaway for the exam for an approval process. If you need to automate approving or rejecting a record, if it's something that says I need to automate approving or rejecting a record, then you need an approval process. That's really all it comes down to. Again, knowing the basics, knowing that it can lock a record or that it can automate the same actions as workflow rules. But really, if you need help approving or rejecting a record and you need to automate that, that's when you can use an approval process. Okay, everyone. We're looking pretty good on our pacing, so I am going to give you your full 15-minute break. It is 5 minutes after the hour, so 12:05 Eastern, 5 minutes after the hour, wherever you are. Go ahead and take your last 15-minute break. When we come back, we'll probably have about an hour and 40 minutes ahead of us. And, it's 14 minutes now, but we're going to stick to that time. So 20 minutes after the hour, we will get through the rest of this lesson and the last two, and then we'll wrap up our day. Thanks everyone again for being flexible. I'll talk to you at 20 minutes after the hour.